who is John Boland from Unite the Union. John's a regional officer based in Aberdeen. He is the lead Unite officer for offshore and the Scottish lead officer for the chemicals, pharmaceuticals, process, textiles and glass industrial sector. He's also the chair of the offshore coordinating group of offshore trade unions, which is made up of Unite, GMB, RMT, Nautilus, Valpa and Prospect. And with that, I'll hand over to you, John.
Thank you for that, Francis. I'll give an overview of what the current situation is in the offshore oil and gas industry at the moment. We're seeing constant redundancies basically on a weekly basis. Some of that is natural, a lot of that is down to actually government policy. But at the moment, for those people that are being made redundant, there is no just transition, there is no alternatives to actual redundancy. Very little has been put in place regarding either training or reskilling of individuals. We had some work that was done, which started by the union several years ago on the skills passport, which would have allowed it to be easier to transfer from one sector to another. After the launch of that last February, that has basically been put on hold. It's had very little impact on anybody. There is, what's been said is there's a lot of good words that are being said, but it's not helping anybody that's actually been made redundant at the moment. And the level of redundancies we are seeing, and we averaged that last year, was sitting at around about 2,500 a year. That will continue at the moment. And for these individuals, and many of them are asking, what is the roadmap for me to get other work, to get into other sectors? There's nothing really there for them. It's a case of, well, you're being redundant, or maybe you can get in touch with PACE, or if they don't live in Scotland, with Job Centre Plus. But that's about the only options. So it would be good if this meeting could come up with actual options, but it's got to be meaningful options that are going to have some backing as well, and not just words.
Very much, John, and thank you for being keeping to time. That is appreciated. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, which is Chris Hamilton, also with Unite the Union. And Chris is a worker at Grangemouth Oil Refinery, the convener at Grangemouth Oil Refinery. I still believe you still are the convener, Chris. And Chris has really been instrumental in leading the Keep Grangemouth Working campaign, and I'd say an inspiration to many in the trade union movement in terms of fighting for his colleagues in his community. So I'll pass over to you, Chris, and good to have you here.
Good afternoon. Everybody hear me okay? Yes, good afternoon, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me along. As you say, I am the convener at Petronas Grangemouth. Unfortunately, as of April this year, it's no longer a refinery, it's an import terminal. So in terms of the concept of just transition, what Grangemouth I think has showed us is that there is no credible pathway for workers in the energy sector to move to alternatives as it stands at present. And as John said, I mean, with Grangemouth, there is plenty of promises and pledges, whether it be investment, whether it be training commitments, whether it be all sorts of support packages, which of course was negotiated by this union. But even despite all that, that's of course only as good as the job opportunities that are there for workers to take. And in the case of Grangemouth, I mean, we've had over 400 redundancies as it stands now. There are potentially up to 3,000 redundancies to take place as the knock-on impact takes hold. And the vast majority of these workers that I'm seeing, and of course they're colleagues of mine, have either went into oil and gas elsewhere, and in some cases in the Middle East, away from Scotland and the United Kingdom, and others have stayed locally, have taken up sort of local jobs, and of course those local jobs don't come with the same terms and conditions that the refinery and the oil and gas sector, of course, enjoy. So, I mean, what Grangemouth, I suppose, is showing us is in the concept of just transition, there's no really a credible pathway. And in the respect to how Grangemouth got in the situation that it did, for me, of course, it was a decision that was made by a private enterprise that owns that site. And of course, there's questions being asked for decades and still will be questions asked today and going forward about who owns these sites, these critical pieces of national infrastructure. But for us, in terms of the response of what's happened at Grangemouth, there's been two big failings. The first one has been a failure to safeguard the current assets, and we're seeing that now, for example, at Mossburn as well. It's not just Grangemouth. But alongside that, we're also failing as a nation to create these jobs of the future. And I think as a sort of labour movement, sometimes we're too sort of spend a bit of time on one of these issues in particular. So, for example, we've got people who are maybe on the sort of climate activist side of the movement who want to talk about the new jobs and where are they, and that's fine. And then there'll be other people in the movement who just want to talk about the jobs that are here today. But the reality is, we've obviously failed at both of those things because we've not saved the Grangemouth refinery. We're obviously in the middle of a battle for saving Mossburn. But at the same time, we're not creating these jobs for the future. So I suppose we need to start thinking holistically. I mean, Grangemouth showed you that, like I say, there isn't a credible pathway. And we've said from day one that if we can't achieve it at a place like Grangemouth, getting a 100-year-old oil refinery that's sort of become a symbol of Scotland's industry, if we can't do it there, then where are we going to do it? Because we've now got Mossburn, we've also got the offshore stuff happening at the same time. And yet we need, as far as we've been saying, we need a lot more action and less words and less talk and less promises in regards to that. And yeah, I would like to see the Grangemouth situation, for all it's of course tragic for us, it's tragic for many of my colleagues who have lost work. Grangemouth should, of course, now, as far as I'm concerned, be a symbol of how we shouldn't deal with just transitions. I mean, it's worth saying there's been absolutely no transition whatsoever at Grangemouth. The only transition we've had is the move away from an oil refinery and an import terminal. So it isn't a just transition, but it's highlighted that the energy sector isn't in a place at present where workers can leave a fossil fuel-based industry like at Grangemouth and take up alternatives, because it stands right now, they do not exist.
Thank you very much, Chris. Lots there, and I'm sure people will come back to you with questions and also to John. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, which is Catrina Randall from Friends of Earth Scotland. Catrina is a Just Transition campaigner at Friends of Earth Scotland, which is Scotland's leading climate campaigning organisation and one of the founders of the Just Transition Partnership. She campaigns for a fair transition for workers and communities, working closely with trade union partners. She previously spent 7 years coordinating and delivering political education, movement building and community organising projects across various contexts. And I'll pass over to you, Catrina.
Thanks, Francis. This is the bit where I sort of try and get the screen share to work and ask you all if you can see it or not. 2 seconds. There we go. Let me know when you can see.
Yeah, great.
So as Francis said, my name is Catrina Randall. I am the Just Transition campaigner at Friends of Earth Scotland. I'm here today to talk about 2 reports, the first of which, Our Power, I think a lot of folk in this room might be quite familiar with. And for those who aren't, this is a report that was published by Platform and Friends of the Earth Scotland in 2023, which was created with the help of trade unions and brought together North Sea oil and gas worker demands on the energy transition. This report was a bit of a first in terms of workers and climate groups kind of co-creating an agenda for just transition in that way. And I won't kind of go into the full history, but this is a piece of work that absolutely grew from long-term dialogue between climate groups and the union movement, including, of course, the Just Transition Partnership. And the second report is a newer one, which came out in September this year, published by Platform and endorsed by Friends of Earth Scotland, which is a bit of a follow-up to that report. So I think it's kind of useful and interesting, in my opinion, to talk about the process of Our Power and the kind of large amount of work that went into this. So this report kind of started with 6 in-person workshops with 34 workers from Aberdeen, Newcastle and Edinburgh, who came from like a wide variety of workers across the sector. It was kind of furlough at the time that this happened, which meant that there was actually quite a lot of people who were kind of keen and able to get involved with this process. And you can see like the full breakdown in the report of the wide variety of workers from across the sector that were involved like across this process. So these 6 workshops drew out 10 demands, which were then refined through kind of telephone consultations to make sure that they really captured what was being expressed in those workshops. And these 10 demands were then tested through a survey of over 1,000 workers. Now, this was several years ago, and at the time, most folk that were surveyed hadn't actually heard the term just transition, and only 40%. And it generally painted quite a bleak picture of workers feeling that they were being completely left behind in a declining sector, and what we would call like an unjust transition. So, however, these 10 demands that were created had a very high level of support across the 1,000 surveyed workers. So every single demand here had at least 90% support. Many had a higher rating than that. And there was a mix of demands, both the kind of immediate support for workers and broader, kind of more structural demands. And kind of as we've said, we can't really talk about worker support without talking about kind of new jobs and about the energy system itself. So I am going to speak to kind of all three of these themes. The first of which is the kind of immediate demands in the R transition section. So here we've got demands around workers being at the centre of transition planning, clear, accessible pathways out of high carbon jobs, a training regime that is built to keep workers safe instead of for profit, and investment in domestic manufacturing and assembly for renewables. So making sure we've got the infrastructure that we need to take advantage of this transition to renewables and to actually create jobs here in the UK. The next section, our rights, is about making sure that jobs in renewables, but also in oil and gas, are well paid and safe. So in this, we've got demands for collective bargaining across the whole offshore industry, universal rights and wage floor across the UK continental shelf, and effective and trusted whistleblowing process. And the final section, our energy, is about building a new energy system where the benefits are shared fairly. So this has a demand around public ownership for the public good. So this is around who owns and who benefits from our energy system. And this is something that came through pretty strongly in the workshops. We found that, folk engaging in these workshops maybe didn't talk with the same terms as we might see, like campaign groups talking about it, but the values and the ideas are absolutely there. There's also a demand about reorganizing the tax system for the public good, addressing these like astronomical profits of oil and gas companies and energy companies. And finally, no community left behind. So kind of placing these demands back in the communities, particularly in the Northeast, where, people are seeing money that is created in Aberdeen taken straight out of Aberdeen again, and the benefits not being felt by the communities. In the report itself, you can read in more granular detail kind of these policy demands, suggestions of how they could be realised at the UK government, Scottish government and local authority level. So if you're interested, absolutely, I would go and have a look at the report in more detail. The more recent report, Transition on Our Terms, was a follow-up to Our Power. This came kind of in light of the sort of slew of government announcements around the energy transition and a renewed interest in kind of what offshore workers are thinking around these issues. So there was a survey of over 400 oil and gas workers that happened in the spring of this year, and the kind of focus of this survey was around policy solutions, some of which had been built with workers, some of which had come through kind of coalition work between climate groups and unions. And it was testing how offshore workers felt about these demands. It also included a bit of an insight into working conditions in 2025, which I won't speak to too much because, we've heard from John and Chris, but suffice to say, it painted a pretty bleak picture of increasing insecurity, declining conditions, threat of redundancy, over a quarter of workers actively looking to leave the sector, and 2 in 10 unhappy in their job. The vast majority of workers do not think that either government are doing enough to support oil and gas workers into new jobs. But I will say, the demands that were tested and feature in this paper have similarly high levels of support and resonate with a lot of what was in Our Power a few years ago. So despite this increasingly polarised rhetoric that we're seeing in the media, we can see through this that workers do want government to ramp up action to create new unionised jobs in renewables, to support workers to transition and to ensure that the profits from the transition are returned to workers and communities. So I'll kind of run through some of the demands that are in this. I've split these up kind of thematically, again, starting with support for workers, and a demand for the UK government to mandate pathways out of oil and gas, fully funded retraining and paid time off to retrain, and a jobs guarantee providing financial help for those unable to find equivalent alternative work. Secondly, demands around the creation of new jobs. There's a lot of chat about green jobs, but as we talked about, we've yet to see a lot of these actually materialise. So here we've got a demand for investment in manufacturing and infrastructure, including ports and renewable supply chains, conditions on renewables projects to ensure community investment and job creation comes out of these, and again, collective bargaining in renewables and in the supply chain to make sure these new jobs are good jobs and they are well-paid jobs. And finally, some demands around the bigger picture of our energy system, around who owns it and who benefits for it. And this idea of public energy for the public good. Again, we're seeing high levels of support for increased public ownership as a key element of the energy transition. So we've got demands here around public and community energy, the nationalisation of ports, publicly owned energy company in Scotland, as well as support for GB Energy, equity and ownership stakes in projects and ports for both the UK and Scottish government. I'd say throughout this that there's kind of a mix of demands for both the Scottish and the UK government. We know that both of these governments have powers that they are not fully taking advantage of to ensure a just transition. So just to finish, overall, I think these reports really highlight the need for proper, meaningful participatory avenues for workers to talk about these issues and to find collective ways to express, what's going wrong and what the solutions are. And it's so important that we're building demands based on what workers want, but also that, these are articulated in a way that is
take effect. It's great, really, to see an environmental group sort of centre workers and trade unions so much in its policy demands. So thanks for that presentation. I'm going to move on next to Juan P from Future Economy Scotland. Juan Pedro is an economist at Future Economy Scotland. Previously, he was an economist at the Scottish Government, where he worked on economic strategy and inclusive growth, child poverty analysis, and policy modelling. And Juan Pedro, I think you're going to take us through a recent report that Future Economy Scotland did around policy demands in this field.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. As some of you may know, Future Economy Scotland is a relatively young think tank, and we're working to democratise and decarbonise Scotland's economy. We're very grateful to have a space at the Just Transition Partnership, as we're not a climate campaign organisation and we don't directly represent workers. Instead, we see our role as sort of producing robust evidence research that can support the movement. And our recent report, Delivering a Just Transition for Scotland's fossil fuel workers, exemplifies this approach. We sort of set out to update and evidence the critical point that a just transition in the labour market is possible and essential for workers, and yet it hasn't been delivered over the past decade. So I'll go through some of the findings from the analysis and the policy demands, which you'll find resonate with a lot of from the Earth Scotland request and requests from trade unions as well. If you look at the past decade, in terms of like oil and gas employment, job numbers tell a really stark story. Since 2014, total employment supported by oil and gas in Scotland has fallen by 34,000 jobs, a decline of 32%. And this happened despite hundreds of new licenses being awarded. Meanwhile, green job creation has been painfully slow. For every 2 green jobs in Scotland that have been created in the past decade, 3 oil and gas jobs have been lost. Looking forward, forecasts suggest oil and gas employment could fall by another 20 or 50% by 2030. And recent events that we've been talking about and heard from John and Chris underscored the urgency of these projections. The experience of Grangemouth and the North Sea show what an unjust transition looks like in practice, and planned job losses and reactive policy making. Nevertheless, and we think this is crucial, with urgent, ambitious action, the net zero transition could create up to 40,000 more energy jobs than will be lost. But this is only achievable if we deliver against our climate plans, invest at scale, and build up a strong domestic manufacturing capacity and skills infrastructure. As trade unions have emphasized again and again, without investment in domestic industry, these job projections will simply become the latest in the long line of green job promises that have been broken. And obviously, creating enough green jobs is necessary but not sufficient. The challenge is also supporting oil and gas workers through the transition, ensuring that they can access those new opportunities, and skills are central to this. Our report includes new analysis mapping skills between oil and gas occupations and emerging green occupations. We examined 16 oil and gas occupations against 46 green roles across offshore wind, solar, retrofit, and hydrogen sectors. And we think this is the kind of granular analysis that needs to be expanded. What did we find as a result of doing this? It's a very mixed picture. For some workers, like electrical technicians, the pathway is relatively clear. There's significant overlap in core skills and qualifications to some high-demand green roles, and the main barriers are sector-specific certifications and some differences in pay. But for many other workers, the challenges are much steeper. For example, thermal insulation engineers in oil and gas face not just domain knowledge and certification differences, but also significant pay gaps in a potential move to like retrofit. So within like sector level analysis of transferability often glosses over the real and substantial barriers at the occupation level. The reality is more government action is needed, first, as has been emphasized again and again, to ensure that there's enough demand for green jobs in green industries, and we've written a separate report on kind of recommendations on industrial strategy for Scotland. And second, to support workers to make that transition through the skills offer and by improving conditions in destination sectors. And digging a bit deeper on the current skills offer for workers, the available support for those facing transition like leaves a lot of room for improvement and is very thin. As has been mentioned, the Energy Skills Passport, which was launched earlier this year, was supposed to reduce duplicative training and help workers move across sectors, but in practice, the passport currently covers only a handful of offshore wind roles and is not a mechanism for actual recognition of equivalent qualifications. Workers have still been asked to repeat training they've already done, which involves cost in terms of time, money, and adds further obstacles to the transition. The UK government's Clean Energy Jobs Plan, which was published recently in October, promised a scale-up of the Oil and Gas Transition Training Fund, which is targeted at helping North Sea workers retrain. This will have joint funding from the UK and Scottish government of £18 million over 3 years. And it's kind of building on a small pilot that has been trialled this year. They also announced an expansion of the skills passport to cover additional sectors. And while these are welcome steps, we need to be very clear about scale. £80 million for potentially tens of thousands of workers facing transitions over the next few years is insufficient. Also, the northeast focus of the fund means it will miss supply chain workers that are not based in Aberdeenshire. We need the direct financial support for retraining that's accessible to all employment types, but fast tracks for those who are at risk or already facing redundancy. And we think North Sea employers should be contributing towards this through a retraining level. Encouragingly, the UK government is consulting on this. There's that sort of theme of showing kind of ambition or intention to do things that later are not sort of delivered in full. We also think support needs to cover not only industry body certificates like offshore safety courses, but also college or university courses for those requiring comprehensive retraining. And this will be ineffective if the wider skills ecosystem is underfunded and unable to accommodate increasing demand for courses. Audit Scotland recently reported the college sector has experienced a 20% real terms cut in funding over the past 5 years in Scotland. Colleges are having to deliver less teaching with fewer students to balance the books. And funding for Skills Development Scotland, a key institution in the skill landscape, has also decreased in the past 2 budgets. So we're in a situation where the Scottish Government has done a lot of the right thinking and planning. The pieces are in place to understand sectoral demands and training requirements, but the resources allocated to skills are shrinking, which makes no sense. This has implications for the ability to retrain the current oil and gas workforce and the future green workforce as well. And obviously, in stewarding the transition for current oil and gas workers, skills aren't the only barrier. Pay gaps between oil and gas and many green jobs remain substantial. A report found that for many occupations, moving to renewable energy would mean a significant pay cuts, usually above 20 or 30%. And again, there has been some recent progress on this coming often from the UK government. So that jobs plan commits to a fair work charter for offshore wind, to closing loopholes to offshore renewable, closing loopholes that mean offshore renewable workers didn't have the same employment protections as oil and gas workers, and it emphasizes the role of trade union recognition, which we think is crucial. Obviously, part of the high pay story in oil and gas has to do with it being high skilled and dangerous work, but part of it is down to union involvement in sectoral bargaining. And in the sector, the Energy Services Agreement sets out minimum pay and conditions for offshore oil and gas professions. It's agreed with unions, and employers voluntarily sign up because it eases employment negotiations and it attracts workers. And we think these models need to be protected as the sector shrinks, so there isn't a race to the bottom on conditions. And this sort of sectoral bargaining needs to be expanded in renewable energy sectors too. And the Scottish Government can play a role in developing these practices as it is doing in the care sector. Just finally, we need to level the playing field so we're not constantly playing catch up on decisions made in corporate boardrooms. So our report recommends developing more regular surveys of oil and gas employment trends and expectations, so we understand the sector's dynamics through statistics, not via news headlines and company announcements. And we need tightened requirements for official notices when companies plan significant changes in workforce. We also need to ensure union representation and skills support are embedded in those discussions, not as an afterthought, but put right at the center of it. So just to sum up, a just transition is possible. Our research shows job creation potential is there, but possible is not inevitable. The past decade has shown us what happens when we leave this to market forces: 34,000 jobs lost, green job creation that hasn't kept pace, and workers repeatedly blindsided by a closure announcement. The offer for workers need to be more ambitious, real funding for retraining directed at those most at risk, a skill passport that actually reduces duplication rather than just mapping pathways, binding commitments on pay and conditions, and stronger requirements for union involvement in workforce changes. All of this should be supported by better funding for colleges and an industrial strategy that nurtures domestic industries and supports manufacturing jobs. Belatedly, there's some moves kind of pointing towards this direction from the policy space, but what matters now is that these are backed by the necessary resources and the political will to deliver. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Juan, Pedro. I can see a number of questions have come in, and I'll come on to some of those. Also, if you have not typed a question in the chat, I think you should be able to put your hand up and I can try and bring you in. But first, I just wanted to go back to John with a question, which was really about, John, you spoke about, I guess, the lack of opportunities in renewables, but I wondered if you were able to say a little bit about the terms and conditions that we're seeing in renewables. How do they compare to oil and gas? I know oil and gas jobs, we're also seeing the undermining of terms and conditions in that sector, but how do the renewables jobs compare to oil and gas at the moment?
It's a simple answer. They don't compare. It's as simple as that. I mean, an average job for working 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off on offshore wind is roughly around about 36,000. For the Sunward post offshore, it's about 64,000. So right away, there's a significant difference there. Apart from that, then you've also got the training costs, the certification costs to actually get into renewables. And I think it was brought up in one of the other presentations. That was one of the things the skills passport was meant to actually rectify. It's not rectified that. You're still having to pay these. And the biggest elephant in the room is all the training in the world is great. But if there's no jobs, what are you training people for? And we've got a great example of that with Scottish Government. It just done funding for offshore workers. 60 to 70% of that went on getting GWO, Global Wind Organisation certification. As far as we're aware, nobody that got that certification has actually got a job in offshore wind. That certification is time limited, so basically the money's to an extent being wasted. If there is training there and funding there, it needs to be targeted where there's going to be jobs for people to actually go into.
Thanks, John. I'm also aware from some sister unions in terms of some of the, say, the vessel support. There's also real issues around not even paying the minimum wage because there's loopholes in employment law that allow migrant workers to be brought in at less than the minimum wage and so on. So there's real issues in that sector also in terms of that and unionisation. I'm going to move on then to some of the questions that came in on the chat. And there was a couple, I think, around Moran. And it was basically about what people can do. So I think there was one perhaps for you to answer, Catrina, around what climate justice activists could do. I know you've been involved a bit at Moran. But John or Chris, I don't know if you're able to come back in terms of, I don't think you are the lead officers in terms of Moran, but is there what are Unite asking, or what would be helpful for people, whether trade unionists or campaigners or community people, to do to respond to the situation at Moran? I'll bring in Catrina as well if possible. Catrina, I'll go to you first and then I'll come to Chris or John.
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is that, we're always going to be looking to the unions and the workers for leadership on this. It is their livelihood that they are fighting for. And we want to be, standing in solidarity with them in any way we can. And we've done that, at Grangemouth. We've been at rallies, we've stood shoulder to shoulder with them, and we've supported their demands, and we will do the same for Moran for sure.
Catrina, John or Chris, do you want to come in on this?
I'll come in on it. I mean, as you say, I'm not personally close to the situation at Moran because, like I say, I'm a Grangemouth worker. But I seen Bryce's question in the chat, and I think to answer it directly, it's all of that. It's the local organising, it's the union organising, and it's the political pressure. I mean, in the case of Grangemouth, we have, through our Keep Rangers Working campaign, done a combination of these three things. And the reason we've done it isn't because we thought, listen, let's just go and waste a couple of years doing this, because we realised that it was political pressure that had to be applied for any sort of just transition at Grangemouth. And I go back to my earlier statement, that was through their initial demands extending that oil refinery asset for as long as possible. And then at the same time talk about job creation and transitioning by future-proofing basically jobs at Grangemouth. And the way in which we set out to do that was through that local activism. It was through working, by the way, we've worked with every single political party. We've met with First Ministers, we've met with Energy Ministers. And the point being that when we're having these meetings with these people, it's not a secret that some of the outcomes of these meetings haven't been successful whatsoever. We've therefore had to go back to the sort of grassroots organising, the sort of local campaigning, because ultimately, of course, in politics, it's about votes and it's about publicity. And that's where we as workers at Grangemouth, that's where we've sort of established our campaigning space, is to be about, of course, establish what our demands are. And for Moran, I'm not close to the work specifically in terms of what that work stream is. But for us, it's about getting out there in the public. And if we're not getting the answers and we're not getting the reaction from governments that we think we should be, then to answer Bryce's question directly, it's all of the above.
Great answer. Does anyone else want to come in on Moran? And if not, I can move on to the next question. So I think there was a couple of questions around, I guess, policy levers. So I wonder if, Juan, Pedro, I might come to you first on this. Like, you spoke about a number of different policy levers. What one policy lever would you prioritise from, say, the Scottish Government, the UK Government, or from political parties, ideally within the next year, or thinking about the Scottish election? What do you think is the most important policy lever which other things might flow from in terms of getting a just transition?
I think sort of in a report we set out recommendations across 4 kind of themes, and obviously sort of you need action on all of them. But I think something that does come through, I think in what we've heard from like Chris and John, is like, if the jobs are in there, you can give however many kind of retraining opportunities, but there's no destination kind of available. So I think in terms of job creation, I think there needs to be like a lot more attention to how the Scottish government can kind of direct economic activity or like spending and therefore economic activity towards domestic manufacturing. I think there's a comment from Ewan in the chat, like just highlighting the fact that a lot of this oil and gas and renewable companies are international companies making decisions based on sort of global portfolios of investment, and they're sort of not thinking of prioritizing local job creation. So I think like there's like many different things you can do there, but one thing that can help get the voice of the Scottish government on the table could be to take equity stakes, for example, on like wind development, and even if it's not a majority stake, that not only has a financial kind of implication for the Scottish government from like future profits, but also it means it's a stakeholder in the project, and it will have an influence on decisions about where it sources its resources from, what worker conditions it establishes, etc. And there's also kind of there's that sort of direct equity stake, which is a big sort of, it requires like the Scottish government to put up money, but there's also ways you can influence companies' decisions without that sort of initial investment, by thinking a bit more creatively about how you use conditionality in your procurement process. I think there needs to be a lot more kind of work done there.
Thanks, Juan, Pedro. Does anyone else want to come in on that question around policy levers? John?
Yeah. One of the things that we asked for many years ago when farms were starting or they were looking at offshore wind was, given that the Scottish government licensed the actual offshore wind, if there was conditionality was put into the actual licensing. And that's never happened. And we asked for something very simple at the time. We asked for the actual the fair work commitments to be put into the licensing. And even something that's fairly basic there was still not actually done with that. So there needs to be more commitment from the Scottish government, particularly around wind, if they want actually that to be an industry that's going to succeed.
And I know there was some local content requirements on the Scotland leasing round, but there was no fair work conditions attached to them whatsoever. And I think even the local content conditions the penalties for breaching those are so low that it's questionable whether they'll have any material impact. I'm going to move on to the next question, which I think was around key technologies. And I guess I can try and answer it from an STC perspective in terms of what are the key sort of technologies to back. We did a report back in 2-3 years ago now around green jobs in Scotland, and it basically estimated the number of jobs that could be created across sectors in order to meet climate targets. And I think the key thing from that was almost less about what's the most important technology, but more about the way in which you do it is the most important thing. So there was like in wind, for example, I think the range of jobs created ranged from sort of like 9,000 to 90,000, depending on whether you did what Juan Pedro was talking about. You had a domestic manufacturing base, whether you had equity stakes and public ownership of that sector. So I think that was sort of one of the key things around that. There was also, I think the sector that had the most job creation was home retrofitting and buildings. That said, I think there's real issues with the model of how that's being done. You know, we published some statistics around the low carbon and renewable energy economy, and there's almost as many businesses as there are workers sort of in that sector, because basically you're talking about small self-employed tradespeople, right? So in order to upscale the workforce in that, you're not going to get 60,000 self-employed, well, maybe you'll get 60,000 businesses, but you need to have a whole model for how you bring those people in. And we advocated for, in that report, municipal-led, local government, publicly run companies that would do that work and would recruit the people. So I think almost not to just abdicate picking technologies. I think it's how you do it is perhaps more important than the technologies. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that. I know Friends of Earth have views on different technologies. I'm sure Unite do as well. Does anyone want to come in on any of that?
I'll come in, Francis, if that's okay. To answer David's question, the position we've took with Grangemouth is, of course, about purely job creation, and therefore, to mirror some of Francis's answer there, we haven't really been. I mean, we did say a bit specific work and did a bit of specific work on biorefining and on SAF, but we've never been precious in the sense of which technology comes. And in actual fact, for the work that we're involved in and we're engaging with Scottish Enterprise on, we understand that there's going to be a full suite of technologies that will come to Grangemouth to create jobs. You've probably seen the stuff through the work that was called the Project Willow, which identified 9 different types of technologies that could come to Grangemouth. Now, it's worth saying, by the way, that all the eggs aren't just in that Project Willow basket. There are other companies come forward with that project and says we want to invest in Grangemouth. So for us, it's about jobs front and centre. Potentially through the Project Willow report, there's potentially up to 850 jobs could be created at Grangemouth. Through these other sort of routes that are coming, there's potentially another couple of hundred. So there's over 1,000. Now, of course, the issue with that and the issue with the technology argument is that some of these technologies are going to take 10 years to create a single job. Some of them could happen fairly quickly. And therefore, for us, it's about jobs and it's about how quickly they can come. But also, secondary to that, we're also needing to keep an eye on the terms and conditions that these technologies come with, because some of them might be easy to be popped up and create jobs straight away. But if they didn't come with the terms and conditions that, of course, and by the way, we're not saying that every single term and condition needs to be the exact same, but what we're saying, we're being pragmatic and saying that this cannot be a race to the bottom by closing your existing oil and gas assets and somehow opening up these new technologies. It can't be a race where people's terms and conditions are eroded. So we've deliberately, and by the way, retrofit has come up, it's worth saying, but for us, our primary argument is job creation at Grangemouth, and as it stands now, whatever technologies that presents itself in, we're obviously supporting.
I'm going to move on then to a question around, I think it was from Elliot, around decommissioning. John, I think that's probably best directed to you. What significant role or how significant is the role that decommissioning can play? I know there's been issues around offshoring of decommissioning projects to Bangladesh or elsewhere. Can that provide good quality jobs for people in offshore oil and gas?
I think decommissioning is a bit of a red herring, to be frankly honest. I mean, the amount of jobs that are actually, from an offshore point of view, are involved in decommissioning are significantly small. A lot of it's done subsea. You then the top sides are then taken and broken at the yards, and usually there's not huge amounts of actual manpower involved in a lot of that. Plus, also the biggest problem with decommissioning is you decommission for an offshore asset. These jobs are gone for good, and they're not going to be replicated by somebody dismantling the actual asset, which will probably at most take about 12 to 18 months. So I don't think there'll be a lot of huge jobs created with that. Also, as you also said, a lot of the decommissioning is actually being done elsewhere. We just saw recently the Total Griffin FPSO that's now went to Turkey, and that's going to be decommissioned in Turkey. So as an example, if it can be moved elsewhere, it probably will. If it's been done in this country, it's not going to create thousands of jobs, let's put it that way.
It seems to me like that's a sector that needs a lot of steering and policy change and guidance if it is to create any number of jobs. And there's a lot of talk about circular economy and stuff, but you could in theory be using some of those materials in a productive job creating way, but that's a long way from where we are now.
Just one thing on that, Francis, just might highlight as well, is there's a cost to decommissioning. There's a cost borne by the UK government on decommissioning. I'm not certain that the UK government have actually taken that into consideration when they've been looking at their finances, that the quicker decommissioning happens, the larger that cost is going to be on the UK government as well.
I think there's a hand up, perhaps from Jake Malloy. Jake, I know you previously worked in offshore oil and gas, so I'm going to bring you in if you're there. Are you able to unmute? There we
Hello,
go.
can you hear me?
We can now, yeah. Great.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it was just on your leverage point earlier. For me, the simplest approach is regulate. Simple as that. We've got a sector which is virtually unregulated in terms of renewables offshore. And if you look at other regions of the world, there's pretty stiff regulation in place. You're seeing what's happening with Trump, obviously, in America and his approach to wind. But, just to give an example of how unregulated it is, we've had 2 deaths offshore in the last 3 years. 2 of them on the same rig, the actual same unit, the Valaris 121. One of them just 2 weeks ago when a 32-year-old boy was killed in a fall. His death will be thoroughly investigated by the police, the health and safety executive, because it happened whilst the rig was a rig. That is to say, it was during drilling operations next to a shell installation. The one previous to that, back in 23, the rig was on tow. It was still working in the UK sector, but it was out with the 12-mile limit. And the guy's body's never been found. He went over the side. The regulation for that falls to Iberia for investigation. Anybody working on a vessel, which is classed as a vessel or a ship, is regulated out with the 12-mile limit by the flag state, the flag of the vessel flying. And that is a criminal failure on part of this government. And if we had some firm, robust regulations such as we've got in oil and gas, then we could address a lot of the failings that are happening, certainly in employment protections, health and safety, and a lot more in wind, but also build on that in terms of conditions and trade unionising, organising, and everything else. And you touched on the pay rates, John. I've just written a piece about recent job adverts. There's one here for 250 quid a day, which is £20 a day, £20 an hour, which sounds great. But the shift pattern is 10 weeks on, 5 weeks off. You're not going to get a UK worker to go and work 12-hour shifts for 10 weeks, and they know that. The others are, on average, between £12.90 and £14.16 an hour for working as an AB stroke rigger. So you've got to have all your certification before you get the job, and you've got to pay your own expenses, your own accommodation and travel and everything else. But that's the kind of rates we're looking at. It's appalling what's going on offshore. And the other part for me is that the unemployment is, when we talk about offshore, for every one offshore, you're looking at 2 or 3 onshore. And we're not picking up on that. And these people are suffering as well. There's a lot more that we should be doing in terms of domestic manufacturing and domestic employment rights and protections. Thanks.
Very much. Jake, do you want to come back on that, John?
Yeah, I was just actually the point that Jake picked up there about onshore workers, and notice it was in the chat as well. And you're right, that is an area that is actually being missed. And what we're seeing is a lot of mergers of oil and gas companies. We've got one announced that was just yesterday, which is the next one, which is 3 companies merging together. For offshore workers, these installations will still need the same amount of people, but they're not going to need 3 offices and the same amount of people are there. And these are the people that live in the communities and spend their money in the communities. And that's got a major impact as well.
And I guess just to mention is it like to second Jake's point about the importance of regulation, like none of this is inevitable. Like I think there are issues around jobs in offshore wind being hard to unionise based on the structure of that sector. But if you look at America, now I'm not necessarily always an advocate of Joe Biden's policies, but they did manage to drive up unionisation in that in that sector, actually above, I think, what it was in the fossil fuel sector, because they put a number of conditions of support on companies. They gave unions great access to those sectors, and they managed to get unionisation rates up above what they were in other sectors. There was a question, I think, from Vinnie Collins about the number of unionised jobs in offshore wind. I don't know if, John, you've got any data on that. Like, all I can say on that is that there's data in the low carbon and renewable energy economy annual statistics about the number of jobs in offshore wind, which in Scotland I think is 3,500 direct jobs in that sector. I don't think there'll be data on how many of those jobs are unionised unless you go to all the unions to try and get that data in terms of where you've got members and whether they count as offshore wind workers.
It's very spread out, and we do have members that work in actually offshore wind, but it is kind of spread out across the whole of the UK. So actually, kind of getting an accurate figure is much more difficult than for like oil and gas workers, because a lot of the oil and gas for offshore anyway comes through one office in Aberdeen, so you can collate the number and that better. But I think it's a difficult area to get recognition in. I know there's been a couple recognition agreements done, and it was something that we hoped this government would actually make it easier and push more so that you could get that actual recognition for offshore wind, because ultimately having unionisation in offshore wind will bring up the terms and conditions, will help the safety standards that are there, and will make it more attractive for actual people from oil and gas to move into.
John, conscious of time, do any of the panellists want to make any last comments or respond to any questions they feel they've not answered yet? No?
No, Francis, I think there is a hand up. I see Jim Millett had a hand up.
All right, sorry, I didn't see that. Jim, do you want to come in?
Let me try and... Yeah, it's interesting. I utterly agree with Catrina's contribution and 120-page frontally lobotomising report, but it's absolutely first class. And I think that the second bullet point you made, Catrina, on the takeaway about bold, decisive and upbeat approach is absolutely right. What we know is we can't rely on the market. If we're going for a just transition, then we can't rely on the market. And remember, I'm 3 days younger than grass. So I remember when the shipyards were closing and everything, including my brother, his boilermaker on Piper Alpha, they moved on to the rigs. The employers did nothing. They never had to pay and train or anything. Just by happenstance, the closure of the shipyards went with the development in the North Sea. So the employers' behaviour for the last 50 years has been disgraceful. So I think we've got to look at government, and I believe, and we're pushing this, we've got to put enormous pressure on the Scottish and Westminster governments. That's where some of the solutions lie. And I think there are things that need done. And the Westminster government is behaving bubonically. For example, on the whole question of connectivity to the grid, growth is going to be thwarted by the inability to connect big projects to the grid. That needs to happen. The position of the BP and hydrogen in the northeast is a disgrace. So that needs to be exposed. Maybe if I was an entrepreneur, I'd open up a commode manufacturing base and sell it to MPs, because they should be shitting themselves for the pressure that we should be bringing on them. There's tons of other things. Let me just one. It's interesting people mentioning offshore wind. 81% of the blades in the wind turbines come from China. It's a classic case of social dumping, and it's illegal. And soon there won't be a carbon fibre industry in this country. And where that will impact isn't among us. It'll impact in defence. When Boeing and Airbus can't get a European base for manufacture carbon fibre. So I think there's lots of leverage that we need to play on the government. And an instant one, and I don't know why they've not picked it up, is retraining for retrofitting. There's an enormous job of what needs done there. So there's concrete things that we can advocate to. And if they don't listen, then we've got to bring pressure so that they need to listen.
Thanks, Jim. I just want to reply to that really quickly if I can. Just to be like, yeah, like I absolutely agree. Like we can see so strongly this market-led solution isn't working. It's never worked, and it didn't work in the 80s with the coal. It's not working now, and we need decisive action. And not just for the climate, but to actually take advantage right now of the opportunity we're being offered of the energy transition, of making sure we're feeling the benefits here in the UK, like stuff you mentioned around like manufacturing and job creation, absolutely. And these across energy and across other sectors, like these can be wins, like not just for emissions and climate, but for workers and for people and communities, and actually just building a better future. And we only get that if we are, working together, if we have open dialogue, we're standing together. And I think, from the climate movement, like being really clear that we don't see things like the closure of Mossmore and Grangemouth as climate wins are absolutely not. That's not what we're asking for. It's a completely unjust transition, and instead, we want like proactive, strong, urgent action from the government, and we want to stand together. We want to ask for that, and overcome a lot of this like polarizing rhetoric that is happening, and often like it's coming from like real impacts that people are feeling, and acknowledging that. And kind of working together to find real solutions that work for workers, that work for communities, and that work for the environment as well.
Good place to end. I'm conscious of that, maybe one or two questions that we didn't quite get to, but hopefully we can pick them up another time. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for all our participants and all our questions. Like, I think this has demonstrated the value of bringing trade unionists and workers together with environmental and community campaigners. We've got an election for the Scottish Parliament next year. There's a lot of, I guess, political chat on the margins, which I guess tries to divide our different constituencies around, I don't know, tax rates on North Sea oil and gas. But actually, when we come together and talk about this stuff, there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. And I think it is through those things that Bryce put in the chat and Chris spoke about in terms of community organising, union organising, and making demands of our politicians on things like strict conditions of public support, on things like public ownership of energy and key infrastructure, that we're really going to get the change that we need to see to get to a just transition. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully we'll be in touch with another webinar in the coming months.